Right, good evening. I am Chaobang, and tonight I am going to suffer to talk about how 500 years ago, an impoverished and diminished and really irredeemably violent people called the English, hitherto of limited consequence in the story of humanity and really hardly a coherent people at all, blundered into a new vision of their place in the world with bloody ramifications for all humankind. And you can probably tell that this happens to be one of my least favorite stories in this world. Mainly, I think, because most of its characters happen to be egotistic men, frankly, whose arrogant whims and drooling masculine power fantasies cause generations of monumental suffering. So I make no pretenses to objectivity here. I don't like these people. And frankly, it's a disgrace that characters and stories like these even existed in the first place. But regrettably, this is quite important background for the dramatic changes in Ireland that they brought about. So I'm going to take the blow for all your sakes and eat the stress of telling you about these unbearable people they call the Tudors. Yeah, and the first thing to point out about the Tudors is that they were not even originally English. They were Welsh, actually, from Anglesey, with a little bit of French lineage mixed in there too. And the reason they became a thing was that at the end, England at the end of the 15th century was a humiliated wreck. For some time, the Plantagenet English state had held together as really just a mash of dynasties and territories and feudal relationships that spanned both sides of the Channel. But in the 1450s, the English ruling class finally lost its continental claims after a very long and bitter conflict with the French. In other words, this was the first time in their meaningful existence as a people that the English were now confined to the island of Britain and could meaningfully be imagined, therefore, as an island country. And their reaction to these losses and humiliations was to turn in on themselves in that vicious power struggle they called the Wars of the Roses, which famously nobody understands. And this round after round of chaotic bloodletting dragged on until 1485, when the last contender stood atop this massive pile of corpses. And that was the Welshman Henry Tudor, who by that means became Henry VII, the founding king of the Tudor dynasty. Now, English memory seems to preserve a quiet respect for Henry VII. And this was probably because he had quite a pragmatic reputation. He seemed to recognize quite well the precarious condition of the country he'd seized, and the even worse precariousness of his claim to authority over it. The reason he was king was simply because he'd had the best little army, or perhaps the luckiest, how these things go, plus an indirect and actually highly tenuous line of descent from earlier rulers, and really that was all. So he spent most of his 24-year reign consolidating his claim, both by fending off plots and rebellions from his still very active rivals, and by reforms to revive the exhausted English economy, most importantly through government support to develop the wool trade, which as a result grew into a very important long-term source of national wealth. And yet the weakness of the Tudor claim to power did not go away. So when Henry's son, who's the infamous Henry VIII, came to power, that king's paranoia over it would fracture the culture and constitution of English power in a havoc that took them centuries to come to terms with. More arguably in the context of things like Brexit, which they still have yet to come to terms with today. Ridiculous people. Anyway, they like to call this process the English Reformation, as though it's like just the English installment of the broader Reformation sweeping through Europe in this period. In the simplest terms, the Reformation was a revolution in European political Christianity, in which the Protestants, led by people like Martin Luther, tore down the established power and authority of the Roman Church, with its pope, its bishops, its vast array of rituals and institutions. And of course, the Catholic established church fought back, and there were centuries of horrific religious wars and atrocities to go around everyone. Should probably mention the printing press too. They always want you to mention the printing press for this one. It's important. I mean, for the first time, everybody can have their own Bible and interpret it however they want, at least until whatever shade of Catholic or Protestant is in power in that moment decides they were wrong and butchers them for it anyway. Yeah? So basically, they were as bad as each other. Maybe Protestantism sounds good on paper. You get rid of authoritarian priests and ostentatious nonsense. You could all have your own free relationships with your God. But because it's humans, that soon meant free relationship only as long as it was free in exactly the way you were told to do it. There's all bastards in this story. That abusive gods, abusive people is very shameful. They all fuck off. Okay, so England, focus on England. It was not so much a coherent revolution as a long and bloody intergenerational sequence of political Brownian motion. There was no single enduring vision, no single political program or clear destined outcome. What they really got instead was a back and forth contest of egos, all jostling for power and prepared to cause any amount of death and destruction to get it. And the ego that set it all off, and which in historical memory has come to be most associated with his entire miserable affair, was of course that of Henry VIII. No, you don't get a picture of him. I resent him. He doesn't get to go on my computer. But here's the thing. Whether Henry VIII was a Catholic or a Protestant is really beside the point. He saw himself as a good conservative Catholic. He observed Catholic rituals. He openly despised reformers like Martin Luther. And he was happy for his own minions, people like Thomas More, to terrorize and burn alive people that they labeled as heretics. And yet this was the same king who would go on to throw out the central pillar of the Catholic political machine in England, that being the independent authority of the Pope and his bishops, and to lay waste to the lives of his people, nobles and commoners alike, explicitly for adhering to the Catholic ways that for generations had been the only ways they'd known. So what's going on? Why these contradictions? Well, the reason is because what mattered to Henry Tudor wasn't the public good or one vision of religious truth or another. What mattered was his power, both personal and dynastic. Because remember again that the Tudor claim to English power was extremely weak, whether in the face of internal Plantagenet zombies or foreign imperial rivals. The carnage of the Wars of the Roses was still very fresh in everyone's memories. And so Henry decided to do whatever he deemed necessary to cement his rule in a new nest, both physical and narrative, of autocratic authority, which nobody could challenge again. And famously, in order to do this, he relied on another ego, that of a man who, depending on who you ask, either had a much bolder vision to strengthen and rationalize English statehood, or was just out to strengthen his own position by getting the king whatever he wanted and annihilating anybody who stood in his way. And that, of course, was the king's chief minion, Thomas Cromwell, who came to power by doing just that in the episode which set this whole thing off. Because these people were misogynists, Henry decided he needed a son, that is, a recognized male heir to the throne. His first queen, the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter. And that wasn't good enough for him, again, because he's a misogynist, and they're all the rest of them misogynists, and I hate all of them. Henry grew obsessed with getting rid of his partnership with Catherine, which he increasingly grew to consider cursed, and instead marrying a certain Anne Boleyn, with whom he'd grown infatuated. But the Pope said no. And in theory, you'd think this was because the Pope was a Catholic. And in general, it seems that Catholics are opposed to divorce. The real reason it happened was because Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, probably, the greatest power on the continent at that time, who had just, it just so happened, had just brutally sacked Rome and imprisoned the Pope in a massive humiliation. So, the Pope was terrified of Catherine. She had that leverage. So he said no to Henry's divorce, and Henry grew more and more furious. He himself couldn't do anything to Catherine directly because, that would antagonize the Holy Roman Emperor and there'd be all sorts of consequences. And so you got this massive row that convulsed the English political and religious establishment. All the more as Henry moved to what was, at the time, really a quite revolutionary conclusion. That the only way to solve this was for the king to take over the Pope's authority over religious life in England once and for all. You remember the stuff about the Synod of Whitby? That's like 1,000 years of tradition was overturned just like that because of his ego. Yeah. And the person who did the dirty work of engineering that for him through a huge raft of legislating and threatening and punishing and quite crafty political psychology was Thomas Cromwell. And as he went about this, things began to change in the language and storytelling of these people. Suddenly, the king's power was to be considered divinely ordained and therefore absolute. This was new. It's very important. This is new. For the first time, it became treason, punishable by death, not merely to question his legitimacy as head of the church, or the legitimacy of his children with Anne Boleyn and so forth, but even to think questioningly of it. The king was no longer merely royal, but imperial. The Pope was no longer the Pope, merely the Bishop of Rome, and his supporters, which till recently meant almost everybody just by default, were papists, a new term that came to be charged with corrosive xenophobic prejudice. See where this was going? English authoritarianism was the way now. Anything that differed or dissented from the way became foreign, other, inferior, wrong. One irony of this, of course, was that, Cromwell himself had grown up on the continent. He was arguably about as much an Italian Renaissance figure as he was an Englishman. Anyway, the Cromwellian steamroller would now famously roll on into a full-scale crackdown on the English monasteries, along with the entire ancient heritages and communities and ways of life that had come to rely on them. This too was as much political as religious. The monasteries were rich. By plundering them, Cromwell brought those riches into the hands of the state. And that, of course, would be very useful in the coming confrontations with the Catholic European powers that they were busy alienating. And Cromwell's approach was certainly pragmatic. It wasn't just, just kill absolutely everyone. He and his minions analyzed strengths and weaknesses. They worked out the cheapest and easiest ways to get what they wanted, whether by persuading or cajoling or paying people off. But that didn't change what ultimately underlay all of this. It was terror. Being ill, actually. Ill because of Henry VIII, so excuse me. It's all his fault. Yeah? So the bottom line was that anyone who didn't comply, anyone who got in the way for whatever reason, was to be threatened, imprisoned, tortured, or if all else failed, put to death, sometimes in spectacularly agonizing fashion as a warning to others. Numerous monks and priests suffered this fate. They got publicly cut to pieces while alive. Rebels and intellectual dissidents had their heads handed to them too, famously including Thomas More, who, remember, had been just as happy to burn those who disagreed with him. And perhaps most famously of all, it also happened to the second queen, Anne Boleyn, and a whole bunch of people around her who Cromwell took down when they too were considered to have got in his way. And then, just as famously, it of course also happened to Cromwell himself in 1540, when he finally made mistakes that pissed off the king, and his by now very numerous enemies took advantage of it to bring him down for good. And these people, these were mostly older sort of conservative nobles and or clerics. And the point, of course, wasn't that they were, honest conservative Catholics. The point was that they've hated Cromwell for years because of his working class background and feared, perhaps rightly, that his reforms were threatening their places in the traditional power structure. So again, there was no vision. It was just about their power. It was an egotistic men. One by one. That's why, with Cromwell out of the picture, the aging and embittered Henry spent the last years of his reign under the influence of these old men, so pulling the reins on religious reform in belated hope of easing the divisions that they'd torn through the country. But of course, it was too late. Doors once open, never close. Henry VIII had drawn a buzzsaw through English religion and politics, but he had not filled the gap with anything more substantial than his personal whim as king. So after 1547, when that whim died with him, it would be a free-for-all in which whichever heirs or factions or interest groups in any given moment got power over a now violently divided country would wreak havoc upon anybody they didn't like. And the English were stuck with this now. The heroes and overlords of any given day never knew that they wouldn't be fleeing down priest holes or burning on pyres the next. And indeed, straight away after Henry's death, even within a single decade, they would cycle through a full oscillation on the spectrum, from pole to pole. Henry's successor was his teenage son, Edward, who'd been raised into a committed Protestant. And together with the reforming Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was perhaps the key ideological engine of English Protestantism, Edward went far further even than Henry had been willing to himself. His outlawed Catholic rituals, he had smashed up idols and artifacts, and of course slaughtered large numbers of people who rose up in rebellion over it. But then, after, I think it was about 6 years only, Edward suddenly died, and he was succeeded by Mary. Mary's Henry VIII's original daughter with Catherine of Aragon, remember her? She was a staunch Catholic. She'd been abused and humiliated by these people all her life. And now she got her revenge by driving everything hard into reverse. So, after everything that Henry and Edward had done, she pledged England back to Rome and back to the Pope, just like that, swept away all of the reforms that they'd passed, and set about an infamous orgy of live burnings of Protestant reformers. And some of this, again, it was personal, it was payback against the old men who'd humiliated her all her life and who'd driven those changes. Cranmer himself was one of them, of course. But the majority of victims, of course, were just ordinary people who'd been probably swept up in Protestantism's liberating euphoria, only to get caught in the vengeful Catholic spotlights. Now, that's just 10 years, okay? Imagine what it must have been like living in these conditions, how traumatic it must have been. Imagine, take, for example, the hatred and visceral ill will unleashed by the Brexit referendum. Only imagine the dominant side flips, every a few years or so, and then literally tortures and slaughters the other. It was no surprise then, these divisions, they only grew deeper, they only grew bloodier, as othering and butchering those who disagreed with you became standard. Until eventually Henry's other daughter, the one with Anne Boleyn, the famous Elizabeth, came to power. And Elizabeth was a Protestant, but she was a more moderate one and tried to settle things down a little, which of course only angered the hardliners on both sides, who by now were very much plentiful indeed. And that's why the Elizabethan settlement, as they call it, by which English Protestantism became effectively formalized as Anglicanism, as it's known today, was really hardly a settlement at all. The damage had more than been done. They would be ruining each other's lives over this stuff, over this bullshit, frankly, for centuries to come. Which leaves us with the question, what were the ultimate outcomes of this shambles? What was the nature of this English excuse for a revolution? Well, these are people who always big themselves up and pretend they do nothing wrong. So the standard narrative among them is simply that Catholic England became Protestant, and that this was a good and a glorious thing, and that was how it was always destined to be. Now, of course, to sustain that belief, they had to go on hating Catholics. They had to maintain this imaginative space of an inherently evil, threatening, and inferior foreign other. They still keep that imaginative space, even if its occupants have changed and changed again. That's why they hate Muslims today, you could say. And this, in other words, this was the arrogant, delusional, blood-soaked, authoritarian, coercive crucible from which the modern English nation emerged. One built on the narrative that anyone at odds with the power of the day was considered almost by definition a threat to Englishness, a traitor, and one in collusion with foreign enemies at that. And this mindset would go on for a long, long time, through the brutal civil wars of the century that followed, through further centuries of religious persecution, not only of Catholics, but, of Protestant dissenters too, famously some of whom went across the sea so that they could go on and do the same thing to indigenous people there. But perhaps more than that, through the ruthless and uncompromising mindset that it rooted into the very heart of what it meant to be English. A mindset of chosenness, of an exceptional, divinely sanctioned superior us against a barbarous, inferior, misguided them. A mindset whose narrative power was now centralized under the fusion of church and state power, such that it was not only dissident people, but dissident stories or ways of storytelling that had to be annihilated if this chosen story was to sustain its fantasy. And as this chosen people took to the seas and grew rich through plunder and piracy, that narrative frame would flourish into monstrous configurations. Configurations like, industrial slavery, colonialism, scientific racism, all of whose legacies are alive in the English today. Thank you very much. Go and beat them up.